Good morning, and welcome to today's episode of Experts of the Americas. My name is Martin Casinelli, and I am an Assistant Director for Economic Development at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arce Latin America Center. And today I'm thrilled to host what I'm sure will be a fascinating episode of the Expert of the Americas series, where we convene Latin America's foremost thought leaders to talk about the issues that often skip the news cycle, but have significant impact on our region. In today's episode, I have invited two experts to shed light on an often overlooked relationship of Latin America's, the Asia-Latin America relationship. All too often, it is China's investment and diplomatic ties with the region that gets the attention. But for many Latin American economies, China is just one of several Asian economies that they trade with and receive investments from. Asia's economy, ignoring China, represents about 20% of global GDP. Yet, despite the scale of these economies, their growing ties with Latin America receive far less attention. Taken together, these relationships show that Latin America's engagement with Asia is far more diverse and far more strategic than the headlines about China alone might suggest. But to talk about that and much more, I'm happy to introduce our two experts, Hiroshi and Victoria. Hiroshi Wago is the Director for Global Partnerships of the CAF Development Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, and spent 11 years as Regional Director for Asia, then Vice President of International Strategy and Innovation for ProColombia, which is Colombia's investment promotion agency. He also worked as a professor and researcher on Asian studies at the Universidad Externado de Colombia. Dr. Victoria Chon Ching is a non-resident senior fellow at the Adrian Arce Latin America Center and at the Asia program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. She is an expert on China-Latin America relations and South-South trade and investment relations more broadly. She holds a PhD in international relations from University of South California, where she taught classes on international political economy and China-Latin America relations. Thank you both, Hiroshi and Victoria, for joining us today. Now, I wanted to start off by quickly asking a question about Asia's presence in Latin America. We tend to hear a lot about China when talking about Asia's presence in Latin America, but much less about other Asian economies that are quietly deepening their footprint here. Countries like Japan, Korea, India, and members of ASEAN are building real commercial ties through trade, investment, and infrastructure projects. So I wanted to start off, Hiroshi, with a question for you, and that's, how would you describe the current state of Asia-Latin America relations today?
First of all, thank you, Martin, for this invitation from the Atlantic Council. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of CAF, the Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, and as well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Victoria, here in this space. And congratulations to have this space to talk more about the opportunities between Asia and Latin America. I think this is a region in the world that has extraordinary potential, and we need to continue working with all the member countries of the region to increase the capacity. First, for us, it's very important to mention that this part of Asia that you mentioned represents an extraordinary potential, primarily because of the sheer size of the market. For example, with Korea, Japan, and India, and China, the region has already built some solid foundations with tremendous potential growth. However, the largest untapped opportunity lies with ASEAN. That is a bloc with 3.8 trillion in GDP and 680 million people. This position ASEAN as one of the most promising engines for the future of Latin America-Asian trade, and provide both regions deepen agreements, reduce logistics barriers, and expand business presence. It's also important to mention that there are many complementarities in the structure of the economies between these two blocs. I want to give one example of a Latin American country, that is Chile. Chile maintains an increasingly dynamic trade relationship with Asia, particularly with Japan, South Korea, China, India, and the Asian economies. And for example, Japan and Korea represent some significant markets for Chile, accounting 12 and 7% of the Chile's export to Asia, respectively, and offer stable demands for minerals, seafood, fruits, and other competitive products that show some diversifications in the exports of Chile to Asia. At the same time, the trade with ASEAN remains smaller in scale, but with important growth and dynamic behavior. And Chile's network of the agreements with these economies, such as Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, create a substantial opportunity to diversify and expand Chile's presence in the region with the consumers that I mentioned before. In the demand side, I want to mention a little bit about the Singapore case. That is, I think, is a particularly interesting case because it's one of the countries with the highest GDP per capita in the world. Yet it produces almost none of the food that they consume. And for Singapore, diversifying food sources is existential and is a food security reason. And the Latin America supply is very important, especially Brazil plays a critical role in the diversification strategy. Looking beyond Singapore, we have several Southeast Asian nations, including Vietnam and Indonesia, that follow with trends with similar to India. They increasingly see Latin America as a major opportunity to expand markets. They're organizing missions and they're trying to secure reliable supply chains and diversify economic partnerships in this global uncertainty.
And staying on that topic, Hiroshi, we're talking about some undergoing trends, undergoing currents, and I wanted to ask a question to you, Victoria, and that's what dynamics or trends do you think that people often miss when they talk about this relationship? Hiroshi was already alluding to some of those relevant trends, but for you, Victoria, what are some of those trends that you think people are misunderstanding about that relationship?
Well, something that is, thank you again for the invitation and to complement a little bit Hiroshi's comments, right? I think something that we miss is that we look at China, China is predominant. And now when we shift towards the rest of Asia, thinking about Japan and Korea, for example, even India and Thailand and whatnot, is that these are new relationships. They're not, right? And I think that's something to take into consideration is that it's not necessarily that there are new trends or new dynamics. It's just that the dynamics have been there, but rather they're expanding, they're developing, and they are renewing. So one way to think about it is that when we look at Asia and Latin America, we see a renewed strategic interest, right? And this new renewed strategic interest is basically responding to the transforming global markets and not only that the geopolitical I guess environment that we're living. So I hope that helps you to answer that question a little bit.
Absolutely. And Victoria, both you and Hiroshi were talking, frankly, just about how much opportunities there are between Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I wanted to ask a question on how to seize that opportunity to Hiroshi, who works for the CAF Development Bank. And development banks inevitably have a large role in really capitalizing and channeling that interest that may occur and exist abroad, particularly in Asia, to the region. So I wanted to ask Hiroshi, for a question to you, frankly, on what role do you see for CAF in helping to connect Latin America more systematically with Asian partners, and where could a development bank like CAF make a difference in this bilateral relationship between Asia and Latin America?
No, thank you, Martin, for this question because CAF sees a very clear role for itself in helping Latin America and the Caribbean connect more systematically with partners across Asia. Over the past years, we have built solid and long-standing relationship with countries such as Japan and Korea, and we are expanding our engagement with the Southeast Asia, India, and as well with China. Just to give you an example, with Japan, CAF has one of its oldest and most robust partnerships in the world, working closely with institutions such as JBIC and JICA. And this collaboration includes green credit lines, co-financing operations for social and climate-related projects. For example, with JV, we're celebrating 50 years of relationship from our first operations. And also last year, we celebrate 30 years of continuous access to the Japanese capital markets with emissions of the bonds. As well, Japan has become a strategic partner in advancing CAF priorities on sustainable finance, resilient infrastructure, and a just energy transition. As well with Korea, we have been deepening steadily over nearly 2 decades, combining long-term financial instruments, technical cooperation, and innovation. We began this relationship in 2006 with the first loan agreement with the Korean Exim Bank, which today we have an active line of 200 million US dollars interbank facility and co-financing framework to support projects that integrate Korean technology and expertise in the region.
Thank you, Hiroshi. And from what I'm hearing from your answer, I'm hearing keywords such as energy transition, advanced manufacturing, digital innovation, financial inclusion. It becomes clear that this relationship really goes above and beyond just simply agribusiness and commodity exports as well. So, Victoria, I wanted to take it back to you and ask a little bit about the research that you've been working on. And that's how do you see the evolution of these trade relationships and value chain ties? Are we moving toward a more strategic kind of integration, or do you think that perhaps, despite the great interest
Mhm.
that there is in diversifying that relationship, we're still sort of stuck in the old commodity-driven model in the relationship between Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean?
Thank you for that question, actually. And that's a very tricky one to answer, right? Because when you think about Latin America and the Caribbean, in many ways, these are countries that depend on the export of primary products and commodities and natural resources and what have you. I think that that's not going to necessarily move away because even with this renewed interest from many Asian countries and even European countries and the rest of the world, if you will, right? There will still be, I wouldn't call it dependency, but interest, right? Because I mean, Latin America, it is a region that has natural endowment in not only for minerals, but also food supply. In fact, it is the region that many countries are looking at for food security. Having said that, right, I think that when you're talking about natural resources, rather than thinking about being stuck in there, it's more what we're seeing is a slow, I have to admit it, because there needs to be a lot of investment, and I'm glad that Hiroshi was talking about all the different projects that are involved, not only in development assistance and even for technical skills through these different development agencies. What we're seeing is that there is the attempt to transform the way in which these commodities and natural resources are being exported, right? And that is, for example, to have value added, and at the same time, again, like I was saying early on, right, you have exchanges that are responding, sorry, to the demands and the needs or new trends in globally. And as you mentioned, green technology, when you talk about digital transformation and whatnot. So what we're seeing, for instance, and like I mentioned earlier, is that, for example, for many of these countries, they are interested in mineral resources, but now something that we have heard everywhere, right, is critical minerals, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're thinking about lithium, when we think about graphite, when we think about copper, even, right? And these elements are not only just being extracted purely, but in some instances there is actually there is negotiations and discussions, for example, in countries like Argentina, especially, and Chile, right, where there is the possibility of processing, so adding value, right, processing
Yeah.
these minerals by these countries.
Mm-hmm. And I want to stay quickly, Victoria, on the issue and turn it over to Hiroshi on the issue of those contradictions and perhaps the challenges that exist to channeling more and more diversified investment from Asia to Latin America. Here at the Atlantic Council, we've been doing a number of research projects on how the U.S. can nearshore more production capacities, for example, to Latin America and the Caribbean. And of course, it's not all smooth sailing. Companies, wherever they are, may they be in the United States, in Asia, Europe, will face a number of real challenges when looking to invest, from regulatory complexity to logistics to political uncertainty. And I was wondering, Hiroshi, in your experience, both at CAF and having worked for a investment promotion agency in Colombia for a long time as well, when you speak with Asian investors, what kinds of obstacles or concerns do they most often raise? And a follow-up to that immediate question is, what could Latin American governments or development institutions like CAF do to make the region a more welcoming and predictable place for Asian investment?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. When I was promoting Colombia as an investment destination in my former positions, we heard many times that the Asian investors often highlight areas where additional progress could enhance the investment climate in Colombia, but in this case, we can replicate that for Latin America and the Caribbean. Um, I want to focus in the opportunities to improve regulatory clarity, the
Mm-hmm.
streamline approval processes, and strengthen as well the lack of infrastructure and logistic and transport connectivity. That this is a need, but as well is an opportunity for the investors to participate in these projects. Some also point to the potential for deeper regional value chains if you see the value chains in Latin America and the Caribbean are still weaker than the value chains that you could have in ASEAN or the Southeast Asian countries, which will help to expand investments beyond the traditional sectors. We consider that Latin American governments can respond by simplifying and digitalizing some procedures, as well to strengthening the transparency and improving the dispute resolution mechanisms and adopting clear time-bound approval processes. Better coordination across agencies is also very important within the countries. We see that the single window digital systems and dedicated investment facilitation units can significantly improve the investors' experience. We used to call in the Colombian government back in the days the red carpet, that they will have just one window to have the conversation with different ministries, different agencies, and permissions and this kind of difficulties that they could have. We see that at the same time that modern investment policies aligned with sustainability, resilience, and priority sectors, such as the green technologies, digital infrastructure, and advanced manufacturing help match Asian investment priorities. I want to give one example that is in the framework of APEC. That has been working in this direction. We have been participating in the Investment Facilitation Action Plan, that are the recommendations from the private sector represented by the APAC. And they emphasize a lot in transparency, streamlined procedures and digital tools, and regular dialogue with the private sector. We were supporting in the ABAC committees last year, emphasizing in that how is important this investment facilitation action plan and the implementation to bring not just more investment to Chile, Peru, and Mexico that are the members of MEX or APEC, but for all other the countries of the region that could take advantage of these improvements in the regulatory system.
I'm happy, Hiroshi, that you mentioned APEC, because my last question was going to touch that, and perhaps I will take a step back and put our conversation today in a context that Victoria actually already said it as well. But we find ourselves, at a time when protectionism seems to be on the rise globally. Both Asia and Latin America, I believe, still seem to believe in open trade and multilateral cooperation, writ large speaking. And just this year, for example, Peru signed a free trade agreement with Indonesia, a small example of this continued belief in free trade and multilateralism, as the road for mutual prosperity of both Latin America and Asia. APEC, of course, is another example of that continued belief in multilateralism and free trade. And year on year, it's a summit and it's an event that has continued to work and happen every year. It brings together economies on both sides of the Pacific and continues to foster dialogue despite global tensions, in my opinion. So, Victoria, on the issue of APEC that Hiroshi was also mentioning, do you think that frameworks such as APEC can actually help deepen Asia-LAC relations?
Oh, certainly, right? Because I think, not to be a dead horse, as they would say, I mean, it definitely provides or it is one venue in enhancing intergovernmental cooperation, collaboration, and negotiation. Not only that, something particular about APEC, right? When you look at it, is that it's not necessarily member countries, but rather economic members, right? Mm-hmm. So it allows for the conversation not only among government to government, but also business to government, right? Mm-hmm. So it gives flexibility, and something that we have seen not only through APEC, but through other multilateral frameworks, if you want to think about it that way, right? Is that they have I guess increased the popularity, particularly in the last 5 years or so, just because in many ways, despite protectionism, right, despite a lot of countries looking inwards, they're also using these platforms to create networks. Mm-hmm. Right, and in many ways, for the Asia-Latin American relationship, I mean, APEC is one of them. But for example, even something as I guess complex as BRICS, which is not necessarily APEC, but it's more of an organization, right? That there are a specific number of countries. You see, for instance, that it brings together or into conversation a country like Brazil and India. Right. If you think about ASEAN too, it allows these smaller countries to negotiate as a bloc with Latin American countries. Not only that, if you think about Latin America as well, right, you have the bloc of Mercosur that has actually also been in conversations with countries, right? So they can negotiate at a multi, I guess, multi-country level. So in many ways, it does bring again what I was mentioning on intergovernmental cooperation, but also it facilitates to create a kind of networking and the kind of ties that you usually, I guess, could become more stringent than at a bilateral level. And one thing to keep to think about, and I think it's worth pursuing, right? That a lot of these multilateral frameworks, usually they are not necessarily, the outcomes are not necessarily enforceable, but actually do come. I think here's where the challenges come about, right? They are not necessarily enforceable, but they promote or in many ways allow the space for these I guess cross-regional but also multi-regional conversations. At the end of the day, then right, the ball is on the courts of the countries that decide to take the initiative. And I think that there is something interesting in really taking advantage of these different organizations in many ways. And again, that's an opportunity, right? The question of course becomes is that at what point you move from having these big meetings, having these conversations, have these potential plans, and then actually move it towards something that is more tangible and that can actually be carried out.
Yeah, definitely a positive outlook on multilateralism and the opportunities that it provides also to amplify and diversify trade and investment relationships. Beyond just those existing relationships that already exist between Asia and Latin America, and sort of bring the benefits of it to more countries just than those actively engaging in trade currently. And Hiroshi, I wanted to end our conversation today with a question to you, which is always a tough question of predicting the future, but I do believe that it could be an interesting one, and ultimately comes down also to the belief in free trade and multilateralism. And the question is if you believe that this shared belief that Asian economies, Latin American economies have on free trade and multilateralism mean that these ties are likely to just keep growing in the years ahead. Would you predict that is in our immediate future, both in volume of trade and volume of investment, as well as in the diversity of countries between Asia and Latin America engaging in that trade?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. We are very optimistic that Latin America has a lot to learn and to grow together with the Asian economies. And we have been seeing that there's a very big dynamism in this region, and I think it's very important to be very closer to that dynamism for the benefit of the region. We strongly believe in the multilateralism and the free trade. Our president of the bank, he was former Minister of Trade of Colombia, and at that time he signed the free trade agreement between Colombia and Korea. He started the negotiation of the economic partnership agreement with Japan. Then we, within the bank and with our regional integration team, we strongly believe in these different mechanisms. I want to give just two examples of the mechanisms from Latin America, how they can project to Asia. One example is the Pacific Alliance, and the Pacific Alliance in the DNA when was born was how to project these four countries more to Asia Pacific region. And now we have the incorporation of the participation of Singapore. Then I think we need to continue working with this platform. I was very happy to be participating in the last United Nations General Assembly week in New York of a meeting between ASEAN and Pacific Alliance in New York. That means that it's a very important conversation to keep the momentum and to keep growing. Then I am very optimistic, and I think from the bank side we're very optimistic of the future of this relationship. And I think we just have things to win, working and collaborating together between the two regions.
Thank you very much, Hiroshi. I take both the optimism of your statement as well as that of Victoria as a concluding thought of today's conversation. You both mentioned how it is a pragmatic relationship of mutual benefit for both Asian economies and Latin American Caribbean economies. It's a diversifying relationship that is moving beyond just commodity-driven exports and the mutual benefit that exists already within primary goods trade as well. very happy with. I've learned a lot about today's or through today's conversation. So I want to thank you both, Hiroshi and Victoria, for joining us today. For the audience, if you found this conversation to be of interest, you can find more on the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arts Latin America social media. And if you want to read more reports on U.S. investment in Latin America, as well as Asia, Latin America trade ties, feel free to click the website of the atlanticcouncil.org. Thank you very much, Hiroshi and Victoria, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Experts of the Americas.